Thank you very much, Mr. Seshasai. Distinguished members of CII, colleagues, and many friends that I see in the audience as well, members of the media also. It's indeed an honor and a privilege to be here with you this evening to talk to you all about how we as a country should think about financing growth. And as I speak on this topic, I'll try and cover 2 or 3 different points. And then hopefully after about 15 minutes of my remarks, we can then have a Q&A session. I can sit down and you can ask me questions. But let me touch on 3 topics. The first topic I'll touch on is what are our financing challenges as we look to accelerate growth, just as Mr. Seshasai was mentioning. So what are our financing challenges? The second topic that I will touch on is that how do we then think about financing the state? Because to really enable growth to take off, and I think this is something all of us can agree on, that we as a country have been sorely lacking in public goods. And those public goods are necessary at the municipal, local level, they're lacking in the state level, and they're lacking centrally at the center. So how do we have the financing across these 3 levels of government so that we can generate and deliver the public goods, the health, the education, the infrastructure, so that we can take our growth forward? And then the third topic I will touch on is what and how is the private sector going to get enabled to be able to finance this growth. Now, each one of these topics actually is a 1, 2, 3 hour discussion in and of itself. So I will skate across a number of important areas, but just to give you a kind of survey of the landscape on all these 3 important topics. And then as we get into the Q&A session, you can ask me follow-up questions on any one of these topics that is of interest to you. Now, we've all talked about the fact, as I come now to the first issue, which is, what is the kind of growth that we would like to have, and then how do we finance this growth? We've all talked about, the Honorable Prime Minister, the Honorable Finance Minister, have all talked about the fact that we really need to accelerate our growth, and not just accelerate our growth, but also sustain it over a long period of time. So if we are growing at 7.5% now based on the revised GDP numbers, can we stay at this growth rate, the 7 to 8% growth rate, and rather than go through a boom-bust period, which is what we've had over the last decade and a half, can we sustain this growth period like China has done over 30 years at 7 or 8% real GDP growth for the next 10 or 15 years? And in fact, if we were to do that, ladies and gentlemen, we know that we'll take our $2 trillion economy, which is roughly where we are right now, and we will, over a decade or a decade and a half of this kind of 7-8% growth, grow it to being a $4 to $5 trillion economy in absolute terms, which will be, of course, among the largest economies in the world, and in purchasing power parity terms, probably among the top 1 or 2 economies in the world. So it's a very, very major endeavor for us to be able to take this vast economy and diverse economy of ours and sustain this kind of growth rate over the next decade and a half. That's really the task that we have set ourselves to do, and that's what the Honorable Prime Minister, the Honorable Finance Minister have said we really need to do if indeed we have to take the economy forward, and most importantly, create the jobs and opportunities for our people, particularly the most vulnerable and poorest people in our society, because as we all know, we really have to dedicate ourselves to lifting the 400, 500, 600 million people in India that are in poverty and extreme poverty. That is the most urgent and most necessary task for the government to do. And that's really what we have to do, is to grow at 7 or 8% to be able to lift this group of people at the base of the pyramid out of poverty and extreme poverty. So what does that mean from a financing point of view? From a financing point of view, people throw around a whole host of numbers that if we were to grow at this rate, what would we need to do? As far as infrastructure is concerned, the number that everybody has discussed is about $1 trillion worth of infrastructure that has to be financed to be able to do that. I'll add a couple more numbers to the $1 trillion worth of infrastructure. What I will say is that if indeed we have to grow at that rate, we have to improve our tax to GDP ratio very significantly. We all know that our tax to GDP ratio today, 15 to 16%, when we add state plus center, is the lowest in the BRICS countries and the lowest among the OECD countries as well. It should be more in the 20 to 30% range, not in the 15 to 16% range. So if we have to finance growth And if we have to deliver the public goods, the public services that our population needs, whether it's health, whether it's education, whether it's infrastructure, we have to be able to increase tax to GDP by a large number. That's a very important aspect of financing this growth, is the increase in tax to GDP. Number two, even as we think about what we need to do on the fiscal side, on the state side, we also have to think about what we have to do on the private sector side. Now, on the private sector side, we've got our banks, public sector banks, private banks. These need to, obviously over the next period of time, because they're levered to GDP growth. So if we're going to double GDP, the size of our banks has to roughly quadruple, because there's a 2 to 3x leverage on our banking sector for GDP growth, because of the leverage that they carry. So the size of our banking sector has to go up maybe 4 or 5 times. And we know that with the NPAs and the capitalization requirements of our banks, that's a tall order as well. But if we want to sustain this growth, we have to roughly increase the size of our banking sector by 4 or 5 times. And that means we have to raise that level of equity as well to be able to sustain this growth. So that's a second number that we have to think about very, very carefully. The third number that I would suggest that we need to think about is what happens as far as not the public markets are concerned, but what the private markets have to do. And when I say the private financing markets, I mean private equity and venture capital. Right now, 90% of our private market, equity market, is offshore. So if you look at the private equity money in India or the venture capital money in India, only 10% is domestic. 90% of it is offshore. So we have to find a way, if we have to continue to finance our growth, and the role of venture capital and the role of private equity is very important, we have to be able to create a domestic private equity and a venture capital industry as well. So that's a third number I want you to think about. Along with the tax to GDP number, the size of what has to happen to banking, the fact that we have to be able to change our private equity and venture capital markets and make them maybe 50-50 like China has done over the last decade, as opposed to 90-10 the way it is right now. That's another statistic or a fact that we have to take into account as we think about this. And then finally, let's talk about the public markets, both equity and debt. As far as the public markets are concerned, right now the market capitalization of our public markets is about 1.8 times GDP. So it's roughly about $2 trillion. If we grow to a $4 or $5 trillion economy, if we go to being a $4 to $5 trillion economy over the next decade and a half, our market capitalization, because it typically stays 1:1 with GDP, will grow to $4 to $5 trillion. $4 to $5 trillion, which means over the next decade and a half, the amount of wealth creation we will have is $2 to $3 trillion. Now, some of that is going to be FII money, FPI money, but a lot of it has to be sourced from the domestic market as well. And so we have to have a lot more retail and pension money, retirement money participating in the equity market if we have to finance our growth. So we need $2 to $3 trillion of money coming into the equity markets to be able to sustain this kind of growth. So that's another statistic you might want to think about as we think about financing growth. Those are the challenges. That's the kind of magnitude of financing that's required to sustain this growth. So then let's talk about what is it that we in government are thinking about as we think about these numbers and as we think about how to be able to generate and deliver these resources to sustain our growth. Let's talk first about the tax to GDP and the fiscal architecture of the Indian state. As far as the fiscal architecture of the Indian state is concerned, I would submit, and I'd love to get your views on this as well, I would submit that what we did in the budget and what we're trying to do now with the GST, as Adi will agree because he is one of the strongest proponents of the GST and has been a very strong advocate of that, is what we are trying to do through the devolution to the states and with GST is actually completely transform and reset the fiscal architecture of the Indian state. And we don't have a choice. As I was saying earlier, if we have to grow tax to GDP to 20%, we have to reset the fiscal architecture because what we have right now is not going to get us to those levels of tax to GDP. We have to rethink the fiscal architecture of the Indian state. And therefore, what we are trying to do through our policy making and the kind of decisions we have already made is to actually go through that transformation. And let me now step through it in three clear areas that we've tried to do it in. Number one, I'll talk about direct taxes. Number 2, I'll talk about indirect taxes. And number 3, I will speak about what we're trying to do in terms of center-state relations and the devolution to the states, which is what we've done with the 14 Finance Commission recommendations. And as I said, when you put these 3 aspects together, you will realize that what we're doing with the fiscal architecture of the Indian state is perhaps in some ways as unprecedented and as vast a set of changes as were unlocked in 1991 by the liberalization that happened then. This is a very vast and profound set of changes that are happening now to the fiscal architecture of the Indian state. Let's talk first about direct taxes. In direct taxes, we have to look obviously at the corporate side and in the individual side. As far as the corporate taxes are concerned, we have already said in the budget that we are going to take them from 30 to 25%. And in doing so, we are going to also try and eliminate as many exemptions as possible so that we have a simple, predictable corporate tax code, which is very important. I'm sure all of you will agree. This is a very important step forward because, as you know, the effective tax rate in India is only 23% right now. The effective tax rate across ASEAN countries is about 22%. And worldwide, you find that it's between 20 to 25% is where corporate taxes are. And if we are at 34.6% by the time you add in all of the cesses and so on, we are much above global standards. So we have to reset the corporate tax code effectively in some ways, putting in place much of what has been thought about in the direct tax code to be able to get down to that 25% number, which is free and uncluttered with a lot of exemptions. Because in effect, already we are at 23% effective tax rate. That's a very important set of changes that are going to happen over the next few years as far as corporate taxes are concerned. Very important set of changes. Then, if we think about what we're trying to do as far as individual taxes are concerned, there are 2 very important things that we're trying to do as far as individual taxes are concerned. First, we are trying to provide more opportunities, more tax concessions to encourage long-term savings. Because we want, as I was saying, more money, retirement money and so on, going into the equity markets and into the debt markets and the public markets. So we're trying to encourage long-term savings, and of course in the budget we did that by putting in place that 50,000 rupee exemption for NPS. So we are really trying to encourage long-term savings in that regard. The other very important aspect of what we're trying to do as far as individual taxes are concerned is to bring down the parallel economy and the non-compliance on the individual side. And of course, you know, we have introduced the sort of foreign unaccounted assets and income bill that was introduced in the last day of Parliament. And we are determined to make sure that as far as tax compliance is concerned, that is dramatically improved in India because we are much below where we need to be as far as that is concerned. That's what we're trying to do on individual taxes. That's direct taxes, and as you will agree, I'm sure, between what we're doing on the corporate side and the individual side, these are profoundly important changes on the direct side. On the indirect side, and I'm not going to spend any time on this because you all know this very well, GST is genuinely, as Adi will tell you, a game changer. And I think it's CII that has put out a number saying that if we can implement GST in a clean and efficient manner, we will be in a situation we potentially could accelerate GDP growth rate by somewhere in the region of 1% of GDP. That is a very big deal. And that's why GST, which we are pushing forward, I know the Honorable Finance Minister came this morning and spoke about it as well, is going to be very, very important in terms of improving indirect tax compliance and increasing our tax base. And of course, you understand the implication of having a destination-based tax on GST is that it's at the end point, at the destination you pay taxes, and therefore if anybody wants the credit for that tax being paid at the destination, they have to create the credit stream right down to where the product is sourced, which means everybody in that chain of credit stream has to become digital. And hopefully that will dramatically improve compliance for us. Of course, we'll have sensible exemptions so that if you're a very small company and so on, you don't necessarily have to get into all of those complications, but we're going to try and digitize it to the fullest extent possible so we can improve compliance. And remember, what we're trying to do on financing for growth on the state side is improve tax to GDP. And this is where GST becomes very, very important. So that's direct taxes, indirect taxes. Now let's talk about what has happened in terms of center to state relations. Now you all know that change that we went through in this budget between 32 to 42% is unprecedented. Unprecedented. Prior to this, the largest increase in this devolution was 2.5%. 2.5%. So we went from 2.5% to 10%, 4x what we have done in the past. So now that we have shifted these revenues, these tax revenues to the states, we think we will have a much more responsive state, both at the state and the local level, to be able to provide those public goods and services that are sorely lacking. And so, as far as the fiscal architecture of the Indian state is concerned, between direct taxes, indirect taxes, and fiscal federalism, we think we have completely reset the fiscal architecture, and it's an unprecedented and historic set of changes, which I hope you all appreciate. Now, and I'll touch very lightly on this because obviously each of these, as I've said, is a very major topic. Let's turn to the private sector side. As I was saying, on the private sector side, we have to start with the banks, because the banks themselves have to grow 4 or 5 times. And how do we think we can do that? And this is where our economic philosophy comes into play. If we take our banks and other public sector institutions like NABARD and NHB and IRFC that are also financing infrastructure and financing the private sector, the corporate sector, either you can take a top-down view to it and say, let's tell them what to do and let's try and figure out their strategy, or do what we are trying to do, which is essentially to give them the independence and the autonomy to be able to solve these problems themselves, and to be able to have the boards and the talent and the systems and the resources to be able to solve these problems bottoms up. And there's a very simple way of thinking about it, which is, if we were today to go from, kind of our shareholding in our public sector banks where we are right now to 51%, which is what we want to do at current price to book multiples. If we were to go out, and we are, as the government, we are the custodians, the stewards of the people's wealth, your wealth. We are your stewards. If we were to go out and dilute ourselves from the public sector banks at the price to book multiples, which are on average about 0.6, 0.7, you can imagine what we would be doing with your wealth. We would be diluting all of you, the taxpayers of India, at distressed valuations. So we have to put in place the strategies, the value creation, the talent that can actually work with these banks, come up with value creating strategies, improve the price to book multiples. The average on the private sector side is north of 3. I mean, we'd solve all of our capitalization problems if we could get them to price to book multiples of where the private sector banks are. And there's no reason why they cannot get to those kinds of valuations. So what we, again, from a philosophy perspective, the way we are trying to deal with the issue of capitalization of the banks is to give them the autonomy, the independence, the commercial running room to be able to come up with those value creating strategies so that over a period of time they can solve these problems. So that's what we're trying to do with the banks. With the private equity and the venture capital side, we have introduced a host of changes to the tax code, to our policies, whether it is to REITs, whether it is to alternative investment funds, so that we can encourage a much larger domestic private equity and venture capital market. And again, these are, we think, are very important, profound changes that will enable these sectors of the economy to be able to provide the equity and debt capital that you all need in the corporate sector. So we think that that's extraordinarily important, and we think that that is going to be required. Final point is going to be an infrastructure, and I'll end here. As far as infrastructure is concerned, again, in the budget, we have taken 2 or 3 very important decisions that we think will enable us to really drive infrastructure financing in a very major way. Number one is that we have dramatically increased the financing to the infrastructure side by 70,000 crores, as you know. A lot of that is going to go into the railways, and the railways themselves have been chronically starved of investment for the last decade. Chronically starved of investment for the last decades. You're in the business sector. If you had not invested for the last 10 years in your business, not only would you be suffering, you would also have a surfeit of high return opportunities to invest in. And that's where the railways are right now. We've got just a terrific set of opportunities like electrification, like improving customer convenience, like dealing with a number of signaling and traffic management problems that the railways have, which are very high return opportunities, both in terms of economic and social returns. So we are creating, that kind of support for the railways so that they and others, roads similarly, can invest in these. We've done a lot with respect to infrastructure bonds, where we said we're going to go out and issue a whole bunch of infrastructure bonds. And finally, this is, of course, something that is going to happen, over the next 2 or 3 months, is we're going to put in place the National Investment and Infrastructure Fund, which we've said is going to get 20,000 crores a year of financing, which will enable it to lever it up 5 or 6 times, so that we'll have dry powder, or maybe 1 lakh crores that can now go into both brownfield as well as greenfield infrastructure projects that require that kind of both equity and debt financing. That, again, is a very major effort on our part to drive this kind of growth. And final point, sorry, I just remembered one important point, which is the Mudra Bank that we are putting in place to create an appropriate way to finance the whole micro business ecosystem, which is also sorely lacking in financing. So those are all the different things. I just wanted to give you kind of an overview of the landscape and try to run through a whole series of initiatives that we've undertaken in the government to be able to finance growth, both as far as the state is concerned, center, state and local, as well as the private sector is concerned, whether it's the banks, whether it's private equity and venture capital, whether it is, Mudra Bank for small and medium businesses or infrastructure. Thank you very much. Happy to take questions.